There's a lot to love about Avatar: The Last Airbender, but something that's not talked about nearly enough is how unafraid the series is to go off course and adapt to entirely unique plots and narrative structures. This kind of thing is very prevalent, not necessarily just in shows geared towards children, but specifically in animation. Something